A mother of many children sheltered a wanderer with a wet carpet in his hands during the storm. And when she peeked into the bundle, she was almost speechless with surprise. Sarah was accustomed to rising with the first roosters and therefore never complained or grumbled about her fate. How could she, when she had 4 children and her husband had died as a result of an accident in the logging industry? Peter, her eldest, would rise with his mother. Being the oldest, he tried to help her in any way he could. "Mommy, are you going to be late again today?" the little boy asked cautiously. "Yes, honey. You know, my partner got sick. Now I have to work for 2, Sarah replied. Peter thought for a moment, then added, "Mom, can I come to work with you?" "Why not? I'll do whatever you say. And school can wait, especially since it's vacation time." Sarah smiled. "No, sweetheart, you need to study. You know the saying, learning is light, ignorance is darkness." A muffled sob came from the children's room. Sarah anxiously looked at the door. Had she awakened someone? Probably just a bad dream, she thought, turning on the old electric stove and placing a pot of water to make fresh porridge for breakfast. In the children's room, her son Nick and her twin daughters Alice and Gracie were asleep. It turned out that the boys weren't Sarah's biological children, although she never said so. She always considered Nick and Peter her sons. In reality, they were children from her late husband Daniel's first marriage. The children's biological mother had abandoned them and disappeared with her lover in an unknown direction. Nobody knew where she was now. Sarah gave birth to twins during her marriage to Daniel, which delighted the young parents immensely. Sarah never distinguished between her own and stepchildren. They were always her beloved and closest people on earth. Even after Daniel's death, her relationship with the boys never changed. "We'll manage somehow. They pay benefits after all. And the fact that the house is old isn't scary at all. We can fix it over time, once we save up a bit," Sarah reassured herself. At first glance, everything seemed fine. They received benefits, and she worked on the farm. However, money slipped through her fingers like sand. It was understandable. The children were young, they fell ill often, and the hospital was only in the district center. You couldn't take a sick child on a bus, especially if they had a high fever. You had to hire a car for that. In the summer, the garden was a great help for the large family, where everything grew abundantly. The soil was so fertile that it made everyone who saw Sarah's garden with their own eyes envious. However, one could only guess how much effort and hard work went into this splendor. Nevertheless, Sarah tried not to dwell on problems and looked optimistically to the future. But the death of her beloved husband shook her, making her doubt her own strength. How many times did Daniel warn me, "Don't get involved with these private loggers. Chasing after money." But what's the point of saying that now, she thought with sorrow. Despite the fact that 2 years had passed since her husband's departure, Sarah still couldn't come to terms with the loss. How could she, when the feelings were so sincere and tender that they took her breath away? Returning from work, Daniel often brought her flowers. No, not exotic roses, of course, but a bouquet of wild daisies, picked personally. Sarah loved them very much. She always put them in an old vase on the kitchen table, inherited from the previous owner of the house. Being an orphan, she was allocated this humble wing as her residence, provided by the Social Welfare Fund. It was understandable there weren't enough apartments in the city, so they provided housing where possible. At first, Sarah didn't even know whether to be happy or cry. She had never lived in a village before and initially felt uncomfortable. But then, once she got used to it, she felt an incomparable sense of freedom. There were no neighbors on either side, just a small garden instead of a football field. And there was also a well and a wonderful fruit garden. So what if the house was old and leaning to one side? The main thing was that now Sarah had her own home where she felt like a mistress. With Daniel and the kids moving in, life improved even more. They started planting gardens and fenced the estate. Before, village boys often came to the garden for apples, inadvertently damaging the cucumber and tomato beds. Daniel was respected in the village, primarily because he had a knack for fixing things. He could effortlessly craft something useful out of a pile of junk, which greatly impressed the villagers. Sarah knew that if they had lived together a little longer, Daniel would have undoubtedly repaired the house and built an extension to make it less cramped for the kids. But now all of that was in the past. Mechanically stirring porridge, Sarah reminisced about the best years of her life and quietly cried. Thankfully, Peter, bustling around, didn't notice his mother's tears, sparing her the need to invent an explanation. "All right, son, the porridge is ready. Feed Alice and Gracie in the morning. Oh, and don't forget to tell Nick that if he leaves more than half in his bowl again, he won't get any sweets," Sarah said, composing herself. "Of course, Mom. What are you talking about? I'll do it, don't worry. It's no trouble, it's the holidays after all. Thank you, my little helper. What would I do without you?" she said, looking lovingly at her son. Peter smiled, glad that his mom shifted the conversation. He knew that Alice and Gracie, the twins, had told her about the porridge, as they weren't capable of keeping children's secrets at their age. In reality, Nick didn't leave his porridge uneaten by chance. He had a good appetite, and there was no doubt about that. Peter knew for sure that his younger brother could easily devour a couple of bowls of porridge, flavored with aromatic butter. But they couldn't talk about it because Peter and Nick had their own secret, known only to themselves. Finishing breakfast hastily, Sarah changed and headed to the farm, where she had been helping with the cows for the past 4 years. Overall, she liked her job. She always loved animals and never insulted them, respectfully calling the cows nurses. Watching her mother leave, Peter moved away from the window and went to wake up his younger brother. "Come on, get up, sleepyhead, or you'll miss all the fun." Nick rolled over to the other side and grumbled. "Mom, it's still early. Can't I sleep a little longer? Let Peter help you." In that moment, his brother jokingly threw his pillow at him. "Hey, come on, wake up quickly, lazybones. Who do you think I am, your mom? Probably you were reading your books until late at night again and now you can't get up?" Nick lazily opened one eye, then the other. Seeing that he couldn't get rid of his pesky little brother, he got out of bed and placed his bare feet on the floor. Nick loved summer, it was always warm, the garden was full of berries and fruits, just beautiful. Not like winter, when you couldn't run around the house barefoot, as you'd catch a sore throat in no time or something worse. "Well then, let's wash up. We'll have a snack and get down to business while the little ones are still asleep," urged Peter, his brother. Nick nodded and shuffled over to the old washstand, filled with cool well water from the night before. As everyone knows, that kind of ritual quickly brings you to your senses. And within 5 minutes, Nick was sitting across from his older brother, vigorously wielding his spoon, enjoying the tasty aromatic porridge. After eating about half of his portion, he looked questioningly at Peter. Peter ate about the same amount, then took Nick's plate and transferred its contents to his own. Then, he carefully placed it in a canvas bag so as not to attract attention and headed for the door. Nick obediently followed him, glancing around from time to time as they walked down the street towards the woods. There, a little hungry creature awaited the brothers, one they had discovered about a week ago when they went berry picking. Their mother never allowed them to venture far, so the brothers only explored the edge of the forest. It was there that Nick noticed the little wolf cub, nestled so thoroughly in the bushes that only the characteristic gleam of its bead-like eyes gave it away. "Wow, Peter, look! A little puppy," exclaimed Nick. Peter approached closer and, kneeling down, carefully observed the fur-covered youngster. "No, Nick, it's not a puppy. It's a little wolf cub. I saw it in a photo. Our teacher showed us a whole litter at school. He said we should stay away from them if we see them, because nearby, there'll definitely be a she-wolf." Nick gasped in surprise. "A real she-wolf? But where is she hiding then? And why is the wolf cub alone? Where are his brothers and sisters? How should I know? Maybe something happened? I think he's hungry." See how he's sniffing around? Clearly wants to eat. Nick rummaged in his pocket and pulled out a crumb-covered piece of biscuit. Here, give him this. Maybe he'll like it? Peter eagerly grabbed the treat and carefully slid it into the cub's hiding place among the dense bushes. The creature growled with satisfaction, then eagerly pounced on the food, inadvertently nipping at Peter's finger. Look how hungry he is. Ah, he'd love some of Mom's porridge right now. You'd lick your fingers. Nick dreamily remarked. It's okay, we'll bring him some porridge tomorrow. Today, he'll manage with bread. I'll quickly run home and grab a crust. Just don't tell anyone about this, okay? Peter proposed. Nick smiled and nodded in agreement. From then on, they began to feed the wolf cub, visiting him practically every day. The cub's mother never returned, leading the boys to conclude that she must have perished. Perhaps poachers were involved, or maybe a larger predator like a bear or even a wild boar. During this time, the cub became so accustomed to his new friends that upon seeing them, he no longer hid, and at the sound of their voices alone, he would emerge from his hiding place in the thorny bushes. And what should we name him? Nick asked surreptitiously, so Alice and Gracie wouldn't hear. How about Gray? He's Gray himself. Sounds good, doesn't it? Let's just not tell Mom, or she'll forbid us from going into the woods for berries. And Gray would starve without us, suggested Peter. From then on, Gray the wolf cub became their secret forest friend, whom they didn't tell anyone about. Of course, Alice and Gracie noticed the brothers' frequent absences, especially in the mornings when they were still asleep. But seeing them return with baskets full of berries and mushrooms, they were reassured. After all, where else would the older brothers go? The most interesting part was that even Sarah herself had no idea that her sons had any secrets from her. Today, cautiously glancing around, the brothers stealthily crept along the street. As the eldest, Peter carried a coarse sack with a simple provision intended for Gray. However, today there was no need to fear random passers-by. Since early morning, the sky was shrouded in black clouds, and the smell of ozone was distinctly in the air. We should hurry, Nick. Hopefully, the rain won't start. Look at those lightning bolts flashing. It's a good thing we managed to set up Gray's shelter in time. It's nothing special, but still better than nothing, Peter remarked. Nick looked up and reluctantly agreed with his brother. At that moment, the sky resembled a vast piece of gray cloth covering a birdcage, allowing the canary to sleep. Zigzags of lightning flickered here and there, resembling the tips of the thunder god's arrows from ancient Greek mythology. The boys quickened their pace, hoping to return before the heavens opened with billions of refreshing raindrops. Meanwhile, Sarah had already entered the farmyard, where numerous agricultural buildings sprawled, including barns, cowsheds, and granaries, all resembling one another. Ah, here comes Sarah, a hoarse male voice was heard. Sarah glanced back and met the eyes of the farm owner, Ronald Conway. Good morning, Mr. Conway, she said, forcing a smile. The farmer gave her a scrutinizing look and then gestured with his hand, as if calling a loyal dog. Sarah paled and walked towards him on trembling legs. Ronald chuckled, then broke into a smile. Tell me, Sarah, I've been going over the records recently and found out that compared to last season, milk production has decreased by 1.5 times. That's a considerable loss. Do you have any idea what might be causing this? Sarah swallowed nervously. Mr. Conway, but I don't oversee this process. Cows aren't milk machines after all. There are many factors at play here. Grazing, hay quality, and age shouldn't be overlooked. The farmer looked at her with interest, as if a naturalist observing some exotic animal or plant. Hay quality, you say? Age? Well. All right, if you say so. But I think it's something else. And what might that be, Mr. Conway? Sarah asked, realizing the conversation wasn't going well. I think someone, taking advantage of the opportunity, is skimming off a portion of the milk and selling it under the table. I've been observing you and your partner Catherine more closely lately. And what do you think? Suspicion falls on you. 4 kids, for one thing. And no husband. Isn't that motivation enough to sneak milk off the farm and sell it cheap for the family's benefit? Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, her lips quivering. So, Mr. Conway, just because I don't have a husband, I'm automatically a thief? And what do my children have to do with this? What's the connection? The farmer frowned and approached closer, emitting the smell of stale alcohol and tobacco. Well, sweetheart, there is a connection, and quite a significant one. If you had a husband, or at least someone like him, then the questions would have disappeared on their own. You're out of line, Mr. Conway. You know my husband died 2 years ago. Why make such jokes? The farmer smirked again, licking his dry lips. Well, one husband died, but another could appear, couldn't he? Even me, for example. What's wrong with me? I have everything: money, the farm, respect in the village. What else do you need? Sarah shook her head and headed towards the barn. Our song is good, shall we start over? Yet, such a conversation had already occurred a month or 2 ago. It almost led to her dismissal. And here it was again. Unfortunately, Sarah failed to consider one thing: the farmer wasn't planning on backing down so easily. And where do you think you're going, dear? Mr. Conway remarked. No need to rush, the cows will manage without you. Do you think I can't find a new worker in the village? No one is irreplaceable, Sarah. She turned around and met the farm owner's gaze. What does this mean, Mr. Conway? Am I fired? Well, of course, Sarah. I'm just amazed by your intuition, he replied sarcastically. Oh, and I almost forgot. Don't expect your salary, it will go towards compensating for the milk theft. Imagine that, finding a fool like her. The cows aren't the same, the hay is different, and the yields have decreased. Farewell, and find work elsewhere. With a wave of his hand, the farmer bid her goodbye. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. How could this happen? To fire someone on such a flimsy pretext, after she had dedicated 4 years of her life to working on his farm. But Ronald had already made up his mind the last time, when Sarah rudely rejected his proposal and made it clear she wasn't going to tie her life to him. Now, watching the departing woman, he reveled in the moment of his power, multiplied by an intensified sense of his own dignity. This was his triumph. Victory, so to speak. Feeling the power of a master, this orphan would crawl back on her knees in a couple of days. And in a week, she would offer to get married at the registry office. At the thought of this, Ronald smiled and returned to the house, intending to recover from yesterday's banquet. Meanwhile, Sarah walked slowly along the street, trying not to think about losing the job she needed like air. It's okay, we'll figure something out. Maybe I'll find something in the district center. Or perhaps I should apply to the post office. Did the world revolve around this farm or something? As if to confirm her words, lightning flashed overhead, splitting the sky in half at an unnatural angle. Sarah quickened her pace, hoping to get home before the rain started. Little did she know, at that very moment her little sons were thinking the same thing. Arriving at the edge of the forest, Peter and Nick looked around, but Gray was nowhere to be seen. Maybe someone caught him? Like hunters or even an owl? I saw it on TV, Nick asked anxiously. Nah, doesn't seem like someone caught him. Everything seems calm. And his shelter isn't destroyed, not even a twig is disturbed, you see, Peter replied. But despite his brother's assurances, Nick felt that something had definitely happened to the wolf cub. On the other hand, Alice and Gracie would soon wake up. So, they needed to hurry home. All right, Nick, let's go. Let's leave a plate of porridge in the shelter, and the wolf cub will come back and eat, Peter suggested, heading towards the village. Nick hesitated for a moment, then glanced at the empty den of Gray and followed his brother. Approaching the house, Sarah immediately noticed that the gate was unlocked. Where did my rascals disappear to? Did they go to the river? And what about the little sisters? Can they be left alone in the house? It's dangerous, after all. Another peal of thunder rumbled overhead, preceded by a violent bolt of lightning. Still not believing that the older ones had left the house in her absence, Sarah jerked open the door. And she saw that there were missing sneakers of Peter and sandals of Nick in the old shoe rack. Those rascals. They never listened to me. They've gone wild without parental supervision, she thought, shaking her head. To her immense relief, Alice and Gracie were still asleep, nestled in their warm beds, peacefully snoring away. Peeking into their room, Sarah smiled. It had been so long since she had seen her little girls, sweetly stretching and reaching out their tiny hands to her. For 4 years straight, she had risen with the dawn, venturing out into the pre-dawn darkness, only to return in the same twilight, now in the evening. Outside, rain had begun to fall. Heavy drops drummed against the roof, sounding like someone had scattered large peas from above. Since her sons were still not back, Sarah hurried to the door and, peering out, saw the gate swing open, her sons running towards the house at full speed. Phew! Made it just in time. Mom, what are you doing at home? Aren't you supposed to be at work? Peter exclaimed, surprised. Standing behind him, Nick lowered his head, intending to hide. Sarah threw up her hands. I have a counter question. Why aren't you at home? Why did you leave your little sisters alone? Mom, forgive us, it wasn't intentional. We just really need it. Nick began, then stopped short as he received a poke in the side from his older brother. Sarah noticed all of this and immediately understood that the children were keeping some sort of secret. So, she furrowed her brow theatrically and, trying not to give herself away with a smile, asked, Well, little rabbits, are we going to tell the truth or play guerrilla games? Come on, speak up. What's got you frozen? The boys exchanged glances, then Peter, as the eldest, began first. Mom, please don't be mad, okay? So, Nick and I found a little wolf cub in the forest. He's an orphan, so we've been feeding him every day. We were afraid to bring him to the village, in case the adults took him away. We feed him with our own portions, but we feed the sisters properly. They're still little. Sarah stood there, hardly believing her ears. Was her 8-year-old son really speaking such mature words? Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. In that moment, she least wanted to scold her brothers, who just wanted to do what was right. After all, they were just kids. Whether it was a wolf cub or a puppy, they were ready to help anyone. All right, feed your friend. Just don't go alone, okay? As soon as I realized you weren't home, my heart sank. Mom changed her anger to mercy and pulled them close. Mom, how will you come with us to the forest? You need to be at work. What about the wolf cub? Will he go hungry? Nick asked cautiously, earning another warning poke from his brother. Sarah sighed sadly. Don't worry, kids. I don't need to go to work for a while. I'll take a week off and spoil you with fresh baking. And then I'll find something new. Hooray! Mom will bake us pies again. Nick cheered, finally waking up Alice and Gracie completely. Meanwhile, the rain outside had only intensified. Watching anxiously out the window, Peter thought about the wolf cub. Had he managed to hide? Had he found the porridge? And Sarah sat in the kitchen, enjoying the company of her children. Work from dawn to dusk had deprived her of this opportunity, but now everything would change. It's okay, there's a silver lining to every cloud. Everything happens for the best, she comforted herself. Suddenly, there was a noise outside. She listened carefully, then pulled aside the curtain and tried to spot the source of the strange sound. What she saw made her tremble. Next to the gate, in the pouring rain, stood a stranger who looked hopefully at the windows of the house, as if seeking salvation. In his hands, the man held some strange object resembling a long bundle. But Sarah couldn't say for sure what it was. Something flashed in the sky again, followed by a deafening roll of thunder that made the children flinch and hide under the table. Sarah peeked outside again and saw that the man was still standing by the gate, as if he had nowhere else to go. Her heart clenched painfully. Whoever this traveler was, he clearly didn't deserve to get soaked through in the pouring rain. Although, judging by his appearance, he was already soaking wet. Throwing on an old jacket, Sarah stepped into the yard. It was raining cats and dogs. At first, Sarah tried to avoid the huge puddle that had formed in the middle of the yard. But then she gave up and went straight ahead, as water was everywhere she stepped. Apparently, the ground could no longer absorb the moisture, so a miniature lake of rainwater instantly formed in the yard. Making her way to the low gate, Sarah opened it and gestured for the guest to enter. She didn't need to invite him twice. Pushing forward his bulky burden, the man dashed towards the house, paying no heed to the wetness underfoot, which he traversed in a flash. Sarah promptly followed his lead and hurried to the house. It was only in the hallway that she realized what the stranger had been holding in his hands all this time. The strange thing she had mistakenly taken for a bundle turned out to be a rolled-up carpet for convenient carrying. "Thank you so much for letting me in, I was starting to lose hope." Knocked on one door, then another, the man mumbled embarrassedly, and then, to Sarah's immense surprise, he began to carefully unroll it. Nick and Peter, who had been hiding under the table, emerged and looked at the strange guest with interest. But what Sarah saw shortly thereafter made her tremble and cover her eyes with her hands. It turned out that the carpet was covering a portable baby cradle, in which lay a rosy-cheeked, smiling baby girl. Resourcefully, the man had wrapped the cradle in the carpet to keep the rain from soaking it. It's worth mentioning that his plan succeeded, and the cradle with the baby remained dry. Moreover, the little girl took it all as a regular adventure and didn't even realize what had happened. Her shelter was well ventilated from both sides and resembled a small elongated house. All of this was, of course, understandable, but why had the man ventured out in such weather? And, moreover, the stranger's appearance raised many questions. He looked too much like a street beggar. Old worn-out clothes, scuffed shoes, and a cap with a half-cracked visor. It was doubtful that he could be the father of the little girl. Although, anything is possible in life. "Mom, look, there's a girl here. So tiny, like a doll. Is this guy, like, delivering babies instead of storks?" Nick exclaimed in astonishment. With difficulty suppressing a laugh, Sarah looked at the guest and noticed that he was genuinely embarrassed. "My name is Connor. I apologize for barging in so rudely, but I didn't have any other choice, you see? I found a baby cradle in the woods. I don't know who left it there or why. Anyway, I picked up the carrier, and then it started raining heavily. So, I had to run to the village," he explained, smiling awkwardly. To say that Sarah was surprised would be an understatement. "Why a carpet, Connor? Where did you get it? And in the middle of the forest?" The man visibly flustered but still answered the question. "One of the residents of the house gave me the carpet. You know, the one I helped the janitor at. It was brand new, and he couldn't bring himself to throw such a good thing away. I don't know if it didn't fit or something else. And I was just planning to move to the forest, berries, mushrooms. I thought I'd build a hut, and the carpet would come in handy. So, I took it with me to the woods." Sarah shook her head. The wanderer's story sounded like a fabrication believable only to a child. Perhaps if Sarah hadn't seen it with her own eyes, she wouldn't have believed it. Maybe the wanderer was hiding part of the truth from her, but on the other hand, all his words were logical, and his actions were not devoid of sense. Approaching the baby, Sarah carefully picked her up. The young mother's heart immediately filled with concern. She loved children very much and was ready to give them her warmth and affection at any time of the day. "Oh, what should I feed you, little one? There's no baby food in the village during the day. And it's too early for milk. We need to go to the nearby area, and it wouldn't hurt to go to the police. After all, the situation is simply shocking, the baby cradle in the forest," Sarah said. Connor anxiously looked at the homeowner. Where would he go in such a downpour? Soon, Sarah herself realized the hastiness of her conclusions. Frowning, she thought and immediately remembered that the local tractor driver, Martha, had recently given birth to a boy. At first glance, the fact seemed quite ordinary, but Sarah remembered that due to the lack of milk, Martha had to switch to formula feeding. Exactly, why didn't I think of that right away? I'll ask for a package on credit, and then we'll see, she thought with relief. Meanwhile, the children gathered in the room to see the unprecedented miracle, the uncle who brought a little princess wrapped in a carpet, resembling a doll. Do you think Mom will leave us this baby? Then we would be 3 little sisters, and you and Peter would make 2. We would give you a sweet life. Alice cautiously asked Nick, who was standing nearby. The boy smiled at his sister. Why would Mom leave her to us? She's not our real sister. This man found her in the forest, so she's a forest baby. Like Mowgli. You've seen the cartoon, haven't you? Of course, I've seen it. But that was in Africa. It's warm there, you can walk around without clothes. And we have winters where you need to wear fur. Gracie interjected. Unintentionally, the children raised their voices, and Connor and Sarah immediately heard their conversation. The wanderer had already settled in and carefully sat on the edge of the wooden bench, trying not to leave dirty marks on the floor. All right, troops, I'll go see Aunt Martha now, and you keep an eye on the baby. And pour some hot tea for Uncle Connor. Peter, you're in charge. Sarah ordered and started getting ready. This time she took an umbrella with her, as she least wanted to get soaked again and, God forbid, get sick. Connor was about to leave, but Sarah gently pushed him back with her hand. Oh no, where are you going in such a downpour? Sit down, dry off. I'll be back quickly, we're very close. The guest forced a smile and, leaning back against the wall, closed his eyes. Hurrying to bring the baby to shelter, Connor was completely exhausted. And now, having found himself in the cozy warmth of the house, he kept drifting off to sleep. As soon as the door closed behind Mom, Nick, Alice, and Gracie gathered around the table and started making funny faces for the little one. Laughing infectiously, the girl delighted not only the children but also Connor, who sat a little apart and found the sound of children's laughter to be a soothing balm for the soul. And once upon a time, such laughter filled his own home. How long ago was that? 7 to 10 years ago? Tears welled up in Connor's eyes as he pondered. Why does life seem so harsh to those who deserve it least? Peter's voice interrupted the guest's melancholic thoughts as he placed a cup of hot tea in front of him. The divine scent of linden and May honey immediately filled the room, which, despite being last year's, hadn't lost any of its flavor. Uncle, did you see anything strange when you were walking through the forest? Peter asked, gathering his courage. What was I supposed to see? Connor asked, surprised. The boy hesitated for a moment, then said, a little wolf cub, grayish. My brother and I were feeding it, it was an orphan. But today we went and couldn't find it. Guys, I won't lie, I didn't see it, honestly. It was raining there, so I had to pick up the pace. You know how it is, the carpet is the carpet, but even it could get soaked in no time. Nick sighed sadly and looked at Peter with tear-filled eyes. At that moment, the brothers understood they were both thinking the same thing. Had something happened to the wolf cub? The entrance door creaked heavily, startling everyone present. Standing in the doorway with an umbrella in her hand was Sarah. Our little one is lucky. Martha happened to have an extra pack of supplies. What a clever girl. She's so young, yet already so resourceful. Sarah returned just in time, as the little one had started to fuss, indicating hunger. Sarah resolved the diaper issue quite easily, the way mothers in our country had done for decades. Taking the baby in her arms, Sarah hugged her close and began feeding her with fresh formula. Connor breathed a sigh of relief, feeling the burden on his heart lift. All this time, he had felt a heightened sense of responsibility for the little girl he had rescued, knowing he simply couldn't afford to make a mistake. After feeding the baby, Sarah put her to sleep in the nursery and began to ponder what to do next. Of course, common sense told her that the first thing to do was to contact the police. But right now, besides the local officer, no one else could help in this matter. Connor himself was not eager to interact with law enforcement, realizing that if they wanted, they could find some faults behind every vagabond. At one point, Sarah even wondered, was he really a criminal? Why else would he choose to sit in the forest like a hermit from a foreign land? Okay, let's wait a bit. Once the weather clears up a little, I'll go see the local officer, she thought. As if reading her mind, Connor cautiously remarked, "Actually, I wasn't always a wanderer. About 10 years ago, I even worked at a hospital." Sarah's astonishment knew no bounds. "Really? As a doctor? What was your specialization? Surgery? Traumatology?" Connor smiled. "No, I was a janitor. But you almost guessed my area's surgery, in a private clinic. The salary was decent. I even dreamed of getting into medical school." "And what happened then?" Sarah asked, still not entirely believing her interlocutor's words. "Then everything changed in an instant. My wife and daughter got into an accident. We had bought the car on credit, we had been dreaming about it for so long. Why did I ever let her drive? I'll never forgive myself for that. Anyway, after the funeral, I fell apart, started drinking, of course. At first, they were understanding at work, but then they threatened to fire me." "And what? Did they really fire you? Couldn't they give you another chance?" Sarah couldn't hold back. Connor shook his head ruefully. "No, they didn't fire me. On the contrary, they helped me get back on track. I quit drinking and focused all my energy on work. Oh, how naive I was. I thought I was needed, oh yes, I did. But my dear colleague set me up. It all started with an investigation from the ministry. They uncovered theft of medications from inventory. The thread led through the janitors to the top, and nobody wants to go to prison. So, they asked me to take the fall. You live alone, they said, no wife, no kids. While we all have families, don't ruin it, they said. Save us. Save? Sarah asked with a trembling voice. Connor clenched his fists painfully and said sadly, Save, indeed. They promised me 3 years probation, but I got a real 5-year sentence. The clinic's management immediately disowned me. We identified the culprit, exposed the criminal network, they said. They confiscated my apartment, and my former friends and acquaintances disowned me as if they had never known me. So, I had to become a wanderer. Not by choice, of course. But really, what's the difference? Connor's words stirred a wave of compassion in Sarah's heart. Towards this intelligent and calm man who found himself in such an unpleasant situation. The wanderer paused for a moment, then said, I didn't want to go into the woods at first. But when they detained me at the supermarket checkout, everything changed suddenly. They started searching me, suspected me of trying to steal something. And when they found out about my past conviction, they got really angry. So, I decided to get away from everyone. It's much calmer in the woods. Sarah nodded sympathetically, then, deciding to support her guest, touched his shoulder. Connor smiled, thanking her for the support. The bad weather outside gradually began to clear, and the first timid rays of sunshine appeared from behind the veil of thick clouds. Well, look at that, the weather is starting to improve, Sarah remarked with relief. At that moment, the sound of an approaching car engine could be heard from the street. Connor looked anxiously out the window, and his heart froze. Right opposite Sarah's window stood 2 cars with flashing lights on the roof. Police flashed through the wanderer's mind. Interesting business. What do they need from me? Sarah exclaimed, trembling with excitement, and went to open the gate. But the police had already taken care of everything themselves and were approaching the house briskly. Leading the way was the new local officer, Michael Willis, whom Sarah remembered from high school. What's going on, guys? She managed to ask. The officer approached her closely and quietly asked, Where's the child? Who else is in the house besides you and the kids? Yeah, just Connor. Well, the man who actually found the little girl, she replied, feeling flustered. The police exchanged glances and then quickly entered the house. Connor offered no resistance, sitting calmly on the bench. In the vagrant's eyes, there was a sense of resignation and an indescribable sorrow, the kind only seen in those who have seen much in life. When the handcuffs clicked on Connor's wrists, the local officer asked, "So, are you going to tell us, or should I start? Why did you steal the child? Was it for ransom? Maybe you wanted to start a new life? To have girls, a home, expensive cars? Do you even know whose daughter she is? Mr. Hooper, the businessman." "Yes, indeed. The one with the factories and steamships, and so on down the list. I didn't kidnap anyone. I found the girl in the woods, sitting on a stump in a carrier. It could have started raining at any moment, so I took her. I hurried to the village, knocked on several doors, and only this one opened," Connor replied, desperation frozen in his eyes. Was he now facing punishment for someone else's sins? The head of the investigative unit entered the room and admonished the local officer rather ceremoniously, "Don't jump to conclusions, Lieutenant. We'll figure out everything at the precinct, who's guilty of what." Michael bit his lip indignantly and roughly pushed the vagrant forward. "Move it. What are you standing there like a statue for? Are you waiting for a special invitation? You're not an icon to be admired. Why are you treating him like this, Michael? Connor is innocent. He just wanted to help." Sarah pleaded, but no one listened to her. For everyone, the vagrant's guilt was obvious, and no one wanted to argue about it. Only Major Mr. Davidson gently pulled Sarah aside and whispered, "Don't worry, miss. You'll forgive us for the intrusion." A signal came from the villagers. Said there's some stranger wandering around with a rug in his hands. What if he's a criminal or a runaway recidivist? We'll sort it out. If he's innocent, we'll let him go, but if not, don't hold it against us. He'll face the full force of the law. Mr. Policeman, don't arrest Connor. He's good. He's like a stork, you see. He brought us a little sister," Gracie exclaimed tearfully. The major froze in astonishment. An experienced policeman had seen all sorts of things in his life, but when a little girl asks you not to take away a vagrant she's seen something special in, it truly seemed improbable. Connor walked through the yard with handcuffs on his wrists, feeling like a criminal. At that moment, more than anything else in the world, he wanted to go back to the past when he worked as a janitor and no one could call him a vagrant or an ex-convict. Sarah watched them leave with tears in her eyes. In the short time she had known Connor, a spark of sympathy had ignited in her heart, timid like a glowworm illuminating the darkness of the recluse's hut. Residents from nearby houses poured out onto the street, casting disapproving glances at Sarah as if she had harbored a recidivist criminal due to her own foolishness. Ronald seemed particularly pleased, seeing an opportunity to taunt his former co-worker. "I didn't fire her for nothing today, Michael. I just had a feeling. Can you believe it? Then, boom, all this happened out of nowhere. I saw malice in it. Put two and two together and realized that besides her, there's simply no one else to fetch milk from the farm," Ronald whispered to the local constable. Mr. Willis grimaced but didn't respond, as he didn't believe the young girl was truly at fault for anything. Arriving at the district police station, Connor prepared himself for the worst. After all, experience was a stubborn thing. What had happened to him in the past served as clear evidence of that. However, the interrogation began politely, devoid of any moral pressure. Then, the father of the missing girl, Anthony Hooper, entered the room. Trembling with emotion, he approached Major Mr. Davidson. "Where is he? Who kidnapped my daughter? Can I see this bastard?" Mr. Davidson frowned and was about to call the duty officer, but then refrained and simply nodded towards the suspect. Honestly, he didn't like it when someone interfered in the course of an investigation or barged into an interrogation. But this was an exceptional case, and the businessman's motive was clear and straightforward to everyone. Anthony approached Connor, who was sitting on a chair, and froze in astonishment. The shock that engulfed the wealthy man was so strong that for a moment he lost his ability to speak. "Connor? Is that really you?" How did you end up here?" The vagabond smiled and shrugged in bewilderment. He also recognized Anthony, and their acquaintance dated back 10 years, when the aspiring businessman ended up in the surgical department of a private clinic with an acute ulcer. Despite the timely surgery performed on Anthony, his condition remained severe. Sometimes this happens when a patient starts to feel like the whole world is against them. It so happened that after several days of treatment in the clinic, Anthony urgently needed a blood transfusion. And the problem was that the young businessman had a very rare blood type. Finding a donor with a similar blood type was practically impossible. The situation became critical, and only a miracle could help Anthony. That's when Connor stepped in, having the exact same blood type. The young orderly decided to help without hesitation, undoubtedly saving Anthony's life. Of course, at the time, Connor didn't think of it as anything special. A job is a job. He refused Anthony's gratitude, believing he was already compensated enough. After all, it was a private establishment. The orderly's salary here was practically equivalent to that of a doctor in an ordinary hospital. Since then, almost 10 years have passed. And now, the former patient and the former orderly met again. However, this time, the meeting was not as heartfelt as the last. "So, do you know him?" Major Igorov asked, surprised. "Of course, I know him." Connor couldn't be guilty. "He once saved my life. I owe him, you understand. Release him immediately. I don't believe he could have kidnapped a child. It's not like him. Surely, it's business rivals. I'm a thorn in their side since I intend to open a new shopping center, so they're furious," Mr. Hooper insisted. "Well, you know best, Mr. Hooper. Especially since we are no longer detaining Mr. O'Neill. He's just a regular witness and hasn't committed any crimes." "At least not this time," the major said, emphasizing the last phrase. Connor breathed a sigh of relief and stood up from the chair. Finally, justice found its way into his life, something he had dreamed of for many years. Exiting the stuffy police department, Anthony glanced sympathetically at the former orderly. "Eva, life has really twisted you, buddy. What happened? Why have you fallen so low?" he asked. Connor paled, not knowing what to say. Then he looked across the street. What could he say? That over the past 10 years, he had managed to spend half of them in prison and the other half as a street vagabond? Luckily, he didn't have to say anything. Anthony understood the situation and immediately tried to help Connor. "Maybe you could come work with me? Want to work in the office? Or if you dream of freedom, how about being a caretaker at my country house? It's a great place, you know? Forest, river nearby, barbecue area. My family and I used to go there often." "Well, until Eva was kidnapped," Anthony offered. Connor smiled but declined the offer from his longtime acquaintance. "No, Anthony, thank you, but I want to go to the village. There's a woman who sheltered me. I want to repay her kindness. Besides, the locals have already branded her a criminal. Can you imagine what Sarah is going through now? They'll peck at her, for sure," Connor explained. Anthony furrowed his brow thoughtfully. "Listen, buddy, are you sure you're not in love? Look, if you need it, we can arrange a marriage proposal and do everything properly," he suggested with a mischievous twinkle in his eye. Connor's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. No love involved. I just want to repay her kindness. And she could use the help. Sarah is raising 4 kids on her own," Connor replied, noticing the mischievous glint in Anthony's eyes. "Repay her kindness, you say? Well, I think I can help with that. I'll take you to the village, but first, we'll stop at the store, buy some groceries. We probably need to pick up some toys too. Kids, after all, they're precious," Anthony declared. Connor was about to refuse, but seeing the genuine interest in the businessman's eyes, he reluctantly waved his hand. On the way to the store, Anthony explained the circumstances of his daughter Eva's disappearance. "Actually, she disappeared on the street. My Sonia just looked away for a moment, and someone took the bassinet from the stroller and vanished into the crowd," Anthony recounted. And no one saw anything? Just like that? Without any ransom demands or anything like that? Nothing unusual happened a couple of days before or maybe a week before? Connor cautiously inquired. He might not have been skilled at conducting investigations, but still, he attempted to think logically, pushing aside thoughts of competitors' machinations and other nonsense. And it was then that Anthony casually mentioned that he had fired Eva's nanny a week before her disappearance. Fired? Then why didn't you tell the police about it? And why, if it's not a secret? Connor perked up. Well, why? She was meddling with my safe, then started getting her hands on the money. Well, in such cases, I keep it short termination and that's it. The former orderly pondered. The thought that flickered in his mind seemed monstrous and unreal. Could such a thing be possible? Doubtful, otherwise why would someone kidnap a little girl from her nanny? He decided not to speak to the impulsive Anthony about it. It was enough that the businessman had gone through what happened. At that very moment, Peter approached his mom and quietly asked, "Mom, can Nick and I go to the edge of the forest? To check on our wolf cub? We'll be quick, promise." Sarah looked at her son with concern. She didn't want to let the children go alone, especially after the missing girl was found there. "All right, little bunnies. But I'll go with you, otherwise there will be no adventure." "But Mom, that's not fair. It's our secret," Nick whined. But persuading Sarah was already impossible. Soon, the three of them headed towards the edge of the forest, taking with them Alice and Gracie's solemn promise to stay quietly at home and not fuss. To prevent the boys from getting their feet wet, Sarah made them wear rubber boots. After the rain, it was quite steamy, and the grass sparkled in the sun like thousands of silver strings. Approaching the edge of the forest, Peter exclaimed in fascination, "Our wolf cub is not here. He vanished into thin air." Sarah looked at Nick ironically. Maybe the kids made it all up? Well, sometimes children fantasize something and then believe in who knows what. But then a faint crackle and the rhythmic patter of small paws came from the nearest bushes. Sarah turned her head to the left and saw a little gray bundle in front of her. "Gray. Gray is found." Nick joyfully squealed and rushed to hug the little one. But to the boy's huge surprise, the wolf cub didn't come to meet him, but abruptly turned around and dashed back into the forest. At the same time, he kept looking back, as if inviting the kids to play hide and seek with him. "What's he doing?" Peter whispered. Nick shrugged in bewilderment, and only Mom understood that the wolf cub wanted to tell them something. Carefully stepping on the wet grass, she followed. The gray creature was not running very fast, although, if desired, it could instantly turn into a tiny, lost in the thick shrubbery. They had walked about half a kilometer when Gray stopped and looked questioningly at his bipedal friends. Sarah approached closer and gasped in astonishment. A wolf cub stood at the edge of a huge pit, which, apparently, had been skillfully camouflaged with branches and grass. Sarah peered cautiously inside and saw a girl of about 25 lying at the bottom. Holding onto her injured leg, the stranger whimpered softly and looked hopefully at the sky. "Hey, who are you? What happened?" Sarah asked. The girl flinched, then cried out with all her strength, "I'm Victoria, please help me. God has punished me for my sinful deeds. But first, take the little girl, she's not far from here, about 300 meters away. It's my fault. I used to work as a nanny for a rich man, and he fired me. I was beside myself. That's when I harbored anger. I decided to let it out. I stole and brought her into the woods, but after 5 minutes, I changed my mind and tried to go back, but ended up in this pit." Sarah frowned. "Yes, we've already found the girl. You, Victoria, are incredibly lucky. Usually, pits like this are rigged with stakes to catch animals. But this one turned out to be empty for some reason. Hang in there, I'll craft a rope out of pine branches with my sons, you'll get out of there, and then we'll see." A glimmer of hope sparkled in Victoria's eyes. "Please don't leave me, for God's sake. I'm guilty and ready to answer for all the evil I've caused." But Sarah didn't judge her. What right did she have? It took Sarah, Peter, and Nick about 40 minutes to pull Victoria out of the pit. The girl's knee was swollen and hurt badly. Limping, she leaned on Sarah's shoulder and walked with her towards the edge of the forest. I didn't mean to take money from his safe, you know, out of desperation. My mother is sick, she needs surgery. There are waiting lists for quotas, but when will hers come up? Who knows? I pass by the safe every day, so I decided to take a little for my mom's medicine. But he noticed, apparently, Victoria tried to justify herself, groaning in pain. Sarah shook her head. Couldn't you have asked? Why did you create such a circus? What if something had happened to the girl? Is that acceptable? It's dangerous for an adult to wander here, let alone a child. Victoria burst into tears. Her nanny's eyes were filled with tears. Her remorse was sincere, and Sarah felt it with all her heart. If they forgive me, I'll be grateful to the Hoopers forever. I've caused them so much grief. It's as if some kind of darkness came over me, whispered Vika. Focusing all her attention on her, Sarah didn't even notice that Peter was carrying Gray in his arms. However, she didn't intend to scold the little one for it, as the fluffy creature had become a true hero of the day, helping to find a person in trouble. Even though this person had not become the cause of grief for her former employers. When the tired travelers finally reached the village, they almost immediately saw an expensive car parked by their gate. Anthony and Connor got out of it and rushed to help them. Seeing her former employer, Victoria burst into tears. The businessman was about to launch into an angry tirade when Sarah took him by the hand and led him aside. There she quickly outlined the situation and asked Anthony not to be too harsh. What a fool she is. I would have given her the money if she had asked. But no, everything sneaky, everything stolen. She even stole from Eva. What's wrong with this woman? Who knows? The businessman exclaimed angrily, but he still listened to Sarah's words. Soon they all entered the house and, sitting down at the kitchen table, drank tea with sweets brought by Anthony. The kids were playing in the children's room, marveling at the beauty and expense of the gifts bought by the same businessman. Gray sat under the table and occasionally jokingly nibbled at the guests' legs. After listening to Victoria's confession, Anthony promised to help her mother with the surgery. Of course, there was still considerable resentment in his heart, but being a kind and forgiving person, he didn't consider the former nanny an enemy. Connor couldn't take his eyes off Sarah, who he was growing fonder of by the minute. Suddenly, something small and toothy snagged on the cuff of his old jeans. Peering under the table, Connor immediately spotted a tiny gray creature. Well, who do we have here? Look at this little beauty. A wolf cub, they say? I disagree, not a wolf. No way, Connor remarked. Then who is it, Uncle Connor? Peter asked in amazement. The wanderer paused for a moment, then said, It's a mix, kiddo. You know, when a wolf and a dog mate. Anyway, it's too early for you to worry about such things, but trust me, he'll make the best guard dog for the house. I know what I'm talking about. My father was a renowned hunter. Wow. So, can we keep him? This is incredible. Nick exclaimed, amusing everyone present. All this time, they had thought they were feeding a forest predator, but it turned out to be a puppy with wolf blood running through his veins. After chatting with Sarah and Connor, Anthony and Victoria began to get ready to leave. Since the former nanny still suffered from knee pain, the businessman decided to take her to the clinic for an examination. Meanwhile, Connor stayed with Sarah. Despite intending to stay at her house for just a couple of days to help out, Connor ended up staying with her forever. 6 months later, they got married, much to the indescribable fury of Farmer Ronald. But the lovebirds didn't care. Anthony Hooper didn't abandon the young family and helped them in every way he could, remembering how Connor had once saved his life and the life of his daughter. Later, the businessman provided funds for the construction of their farm, not without a loan repayment plan spanning several years. Mr. Hooper also kept his promise to Victoria's mother, arranging for her to have the promised surgery. According to the former nanny, her mother is now recovering in one of the best rehabilitation centers. Meanwhile, Peter and Nick now spend all their free time with the noticeably grown Gray, who, responding to their love and care, is ready to give his life for his little adventurous owners.